Hello and welcome to the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Podcast, where our guests discuss ways that they and other Indigenous peoples have lived, worked, and played in the Wakbada watershed for thousands of years. This project was created in Minnesota Makoche, or Minnesota, the traditional and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. The project was co-led by Dr. Casey Keeler and Crystal Boyd, with support from community partners. More information is included at the end of this episode. On behalf of everyone who contributed to this project, thank you for tuning in.
So good afternoon. I am joined today by Ben Yawakie for the Wakbada Bassett Creek Oral History Project. Good afternoon, Ben.
Good afternoon.
So I know that right now you have transitioned and you're living in Seattle, but before that move, when you were in the Twin Cities, when and for how long did you live or work in the area surrounding Bassett Creek?
I originally grew up in Brooklyn Park, which is a ways away from Bassett Creek, but I originally got acquainted with the area when my dad started fishing on Medicine Lake in Plymouth. And so that was about when I was in like 15, 16 years old. So that got me, acquainted with the origins of Bassett Creek and being able to explore around that area. I didn't necessarily know the history at that point of Bassett Creek and, its connection to the Dakota people. But then shortly afterwards, I transferred to Breck School, which is right next to Theo Worth Parkway and Bassett Creek. And so with some of our extracurriculars with soccer, we'd run around or we'd, go running over in Theo Worth. And so that got me to have a little bit more of a connection with some of the waters further down from the origins. But yeah, that was when I first got connected with it.
All right. It sounds like there's almost like multiple kind of intersections here. Even being from Brooklyn Park, it's not that far away from the Bassett Creek watershed, and closer to some of those communities on the northern tier like Robbinsdale, Crystal, but then a more immediate connection through fishing with your dad and then going to school at Breck, which is right in Golden Valley. So with that, what brought you and your family to this area, or more specifically, maybe to Brooklyn Park?
Yeah. My dad's from Pueblo, Zuni, and my mom's from Turtle Mountains, so New Mexico and North Dakota respectively, but they met at Haskell, it's all native college down in Lawrence, Kansas, and they both got their AA down there, and then shortly afterwards moved up to Fargo to go to North Dakota State University. And shortly after they graduated, they found work with, it was then US West, which is now CenturyLink, in Minneapolis, and they both decided that Brooklyn Park was where we were going to move, and so that was in 1991 when we moved out to Brooklyn Park.
Wow. So you were a youngster born? Were you born?
I was a little less than 1 year old at that time.
Oh, wow. So you have kind of lived there your whole life until recently.
31 years.
Wow.
Brooklyn Park. Yeah.
Did you live in the same house?
Yeah.
Wow. That's like such a rarity these days. So many memories, I bet.
Oh, for sure. A lot of memories. And I think that'll tie into, some of what I mentioned with some of these questions, but it was, and then growing up, it was only like a mile and a half from the Mississippi River. Mm-hmm. And so, our parents growing up, I have an older brother, one other sibling, they'd always take us down to the river and, go for walks or go for bike rides. And so I always had that connection.
Yeah. And I'm sure living there your whole life too, you've seen so much change, both community change, but environmental change as well.
Oh, definitely. For sure.
So where did you attend school? I know you attended Breck. Did you go there your entire K through 12 career?
I was actually initially a product of Anoka Hennepin School District number 11. All right. Is that you as well, or?
Yeah, I graduated from Coon Rapids High School, and I was in Anoka Hennepin K through 12.
Okay.
Yeah. And then I loved it so much I went back and I worked there after finishing my bachelor's degree.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
And that was in, or what were you doing for work?
I worked in the Indian education program.
Okay. Did you know Robin Nelson?
I did. She was still there when I was there. I was there for 2 years before moving on. But she worked there when I was a student, a K through 12 student. And then when I worked there professionally, she was still there too.
She was my first Indian education, I don't know if it was advisor or, she would come into our class, and that was from like, I went to Monroe Elementary and then Jackson Middle School and then Champlin Park. And
Okay.
so through that progression, at least up until middle school, I had gotten to know her pretty well, and she was definitely one of the better educators that I've had in my history.
Yeah. What year did you graduate high school?
2008.
Okay, so I worked for Noga Hennepin Indian Education from about late 2005 to 2007.
Okay.
But I worked with students in the kind of Coon Rapids cluster.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that was at the same time during like my middle school years up until 9th grade, 10th grade. I'd gone to some summer camps. One of them was called College Horizons, which is for Native students to get them geared up to go to undergrad, to any like higher education institution. And then once upon a time through the general college, there used to be a general college with the University of Minnesota. There's a gentleman named Mark Belcourt. He had a program called Andu Gikindasuin, which is Seek to Know. And that was a Native American math and science camp.
Okay.
And through going through those different experiences, at Champlin Park, I was just a number because we had so many kids.
Right.
I decided to start looking for other opportunities. And so it was in that, as you started working for Noga Hennepin, that's when I transferred over to Breck for my last 2 years.
So you were at Breck your 11th and 12th grade years.
Yeah.
So we know you participated in the Indian education program while at Anoka Hennepin. What was that education like, if any, at Breck in terms of Native content or programming?
It was very limited. There wasn't too many opportunities for cultural exchange that I remember. And like I know, like during our like Native American month when we had our like all school chapel, they had like a little intro, and I remember it was it Eli, his brother, and Grant, because they were a couple years younger than me, as they were all around the drum. And so I remember they do that like once a year and burn sage. But there was still just like a massive cultural disconnect with respect to the students and also the parents. Because I remember I was dating this one girl at the time, and I wanted to invite her to the Shakopee powwow. And she was raised Roman Catholic, and her mom said that the powwow was too spiritual for her to go to, and so she didn't get to go. But that was like I felt not just like a realization for me personally, but like that understanding of it wasn't just like this individual is like experiencing microaggressions at school. Like when I first transferred over there, I was just starting to grow my hair long, and I was made fun of that constantly to the point where I cut it. And that was like an identity issue that I had. Right. And as I was transferring, trying to be accepted into this massive population of students that started through like preschool all the way up, it was tough to navigate. And so I feel like there was definitely work that needed to be done and still needs to be done. But
I had talked to Grant Tubles and Eric Buffalo Head, so his children attended Breck, and then now you, and I guess I didn't realize or think about that a lot of students start attending Breck in elementary school and probably go all the way up through graduation. So it is probably a close-knit community. So for you definitely felt that starting there in 11th grade.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
So while living in this area and going to 2 different schools and then eventually the University of Minnesota, did you know any other Native families or individuals in the area?
Yeah, growing up, definitely had connections and relations with a lot of the other students that were in that Indian education program in Anoka Hennepin, because that gave us opportunities not only to connect with people from like our school with internally, but then also with students from like Andover, Coon Rapids, Blaine. And so through that, we had opportunities to build relationships with families, go to powwows together, visit each other, have dinners together. And some of those relationships still exist. And, you know, getting to see, like, not only as I'm embarking on my career, but seeing other people in their past that they've started to walk on. It's been nice to see how tight-knit the community still is. And then also at the same time, getting involved with, you know, events and things were going on like at the Minneapolis American Indian Center. Those are other ways that, you know, we were able to still connect with our Native community while still being, you know, like so far from, you know, our home reservation.
Right.
And even in the suburbs where it's just like we're so sparsely spread out. It was nice just to have that community in that place.
Right. Even though the school district is huge, there's still like Native people there.
Yeah.
So let's see here. So thinking more about like where you lived and grew up, was your family able to access home ownership, or were you renters? Were you a combination of the two?
Yeah, my parents, initially they moved out into an apartment when we came out to Brooklyn Park, but at that point they were looking for homes, and then they were able to work on purchasing their own home. And I didn't, as I grew up, you know, I feel like my parents, you know, were able to have more honest conversations about their experiences and how like oppression and systematic inequalities exist. And it wasn't until just recently, because like, you know, as I, you know, start thinking about someday owning a home, just talking to my mom about it, because she's more of the person that's involved with the finances, but she had like an honest conversation with me about when they were first applying for home ownership, going through banks to find loans and finding the one, you know, the bank that they were going to get the loan from, and seeing as the loan officer was going through filling out the application for them, when it came down to race, the person checked off white and went about it like, you know, it was nothing. But then whenever my mom caught it, she was like, hey, wait, hold on. Like, I'm Native American, I'm American Indian, that you checked the wrong box. And the loan officer was like, oh no, that doesn't matter. Like, don't worry about that. But it's very like, you know, as I think about loan approval or denial rates, and even nowadays, you know, with like, it was more recently I saw Wells Fargo, you know, during the pandemic, just like approving refinancing of mortgages, is the denial rate for African Americans was disproportionately large compared to their white counterparts. And so it's like, you know, thinking about the ramifications of housing and financing of housing and how housing builds wealth. It just became like this big understanding of, oh, like this is the big picture. This is how, you know, you could think of something so systematic, but then see it happen on an individual level. With something that was like, it was an aha moment, just because like, you know, I hear about these stories, but then whenever you actually hear about it from someone, you know, like my mother, it has a different weight to it, or a different reality, you know.
Like if it doesn't matter whether you check off white or not, then why are you?
Yeah.
And I think, you know, there's plenty of scholarship and studies that have emphasized the role of race in accessing home ownership, both for African Americans and American Indians. And that's something we're still dealing with today, not only in access, but then access to generational wealth through home ownership. Absolutely.
That's been a big thing that's come out of the University of Minnesota with their mapping prejudice project, just with respect to the racial deeds and the covenants that that denied that home ownership.
Right. In my own research, I'm really interested in looking at that and how American Indians specifically have been excluded, because so much has focused on Afro-Americans, and understandably so. But these conversations haven't always happened with American Indians, and that kind of deliberate exclusion as well. And we see that in some of these western suburbs, entering western suburbs, including the Bassett Creek area, like Golden Valley and Robbinsdale and Crystal. And a lot of those homes that were, built in the 1950s even have race-based covenants in their deeds. So coming out of the Mapping Prejudice Project is another initiative called Just Deeds, where folks can go online or in person and find the deed to their home and do the work to get rid of any race-based covenant in the legal language there. Yeah, but not something a lot of people know of or take the initiative to actually do, or think about like what history that has created.
Oh yeah. Well, I wonder if there's even like just stagnancy towards the desire to do so. Because
right,
like you had mentioned when I said that I had lived in Brooklyn Park for 31 years, talking about like all the societal changes that happened. Is when we moved there in 91, I want to say it was about like roughly 80% white or Caucasian population. And now it's a majority minority community. And it makes me think of a neighbor that we grew up next to in their family. The father, the head of the household, he was a really racist person. He would constantly harass like me and my brother. And it led up to like there's one argument that he had with my dad out in the front lawn, where he told my dad, if you can't live by the white man's laws, move back to the reservation. And that was at the time where, it was still relatively predominantly white. But then over the course of like the next 10 years, as things rapidly changed, our neighbors started to, we had a lot of East African immigrants. We started to have more African Americans move close to us, and it was a matter of time before they moved out. But it was that realization of like, how many other people still have that mindset?
Right.
It can't just be this one person that feels this way.
Right.
And it was a realization that sometimes people still haven't changed, even though we're in the 21st century, and would hope that there would be some type of progress towards a recognition, understanding of mutual respect. But
right, absolutely. Yeah, that's hard. What do you do when you live in that close proximity to somebody who's so openly racist, but you want to have like a cordial relationship with because of that neighborly proximity too? Yeah. Well, it's probably better he moved away.
Oh yeah, for sure.
So growing up, did you live with your immediate family? Were there any other friends or were there any other family members that lived nearby in your community?
Yeah, growing up, my parents were both first generation students, and so they, there wasn't too many economic opportunities either in Turtle Mountains or Zuni for the, the engineering and business work that they were doing. And so moving out here, we were initially just, by ourselves as a nuclear family. But then shortly afterwards, one of my uncles moved out with his family, but they moved down to Shakopee.
Okay.
And so, relatively close. We would usually get together like once a month, just to get together as family. But yeah, unfortunately, we didn't have any other relatives that lived down here. And then, how you'd mentioned just like connecting with Native families, that became kind of like, our community and, when, who we got together with as a family.
Yeah.
Or just participating in a lot of those Indian education program, activities and stuff like that. And yeah.
So do you want to say a little bit about your post Breck years and what you did in leaving the area and coming back, or what you did for work? Was it all centralized kind of in this West Twin Cities metro?
Not quite. I kind of jumped around. I went to Gustavus for a year, down in St. Peter. And this, like, for me, it was this understanding of like everywhere I've gone, I've been close to like bodies of water or river.
Yeah, I was like nothing nearby the Minnesota River, right?
Yeah. And so I was down there for a year. Unfortunately, I was just one of two natives at the institution, and didn't really feel like there was a lot of institutional support for me as a Native American student. So I took a year off and looked for other institutions. That's when I found Augsburg.
Oh.
And heard about how big the Augsburg Native undergraduate and graduate community was, and was really attracted by the idea of being able to study with a bunch of other natives. And so that's where I went for my first set of bachelor's degrees, and graduated in 2014. And after that, I went up to University of North Dakota in Grand Forks, right along the Red River. And that gave me the opportunity to work in this post-baccalaureate program called the 7th Generation Center of Excellence in Native Behavioral Health. It was a bit of a mouthful, but I just got involved with research experience with graduate and PhD students on different mental health aspects, like substance abuse, suicidality, and then also touched on some elder health, like around elder abuse, research around that. And so that gave me an understanding of kind of mental health as a key component to overall physical well-being. At that point, I had thought I wanted to be a doctor. But then I ended up working as a policy analyst after that experience. And that got me interested in utilizing statistics to inform public policy. So I went to Morris and then got a statistics degree.
What is the body of water over there?
It's a bit dry out there.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, yeah. So that was the 2 years that I wasn't close to any big bodies of water, but that had, there was the tuition waiver, which was attractive, and also had a sizable Native population because of that. And so that was another opportunity for me to get involved working with our Native community. We had a Native American garden, being able to take care of that. And we had a great advisor, Gus Claymore, and great Anishinaabe instructor. And it provided a good basis for, figuring out who I am in higher education institutions. And so after that, leads me to where I'm at today, finishing my graduate program with Master's of Public Health and Master's of Public Policy. Did
you go right from Morris into your master's program?
I took a year off.
Okay.
Well, initially I had gotten accepted into Dartmouth for their Master's of Public Health program, which would have been that following fall. But it's $70,000 and it's only a 1-year program. And then I'd be moving out to Vermont, having to take out, additional
for a year.
Yeah. And so thinking about like $100,000+ price tag for 1 year,
right?
Feasible. It was like, what am I going to acquire in terms of knowledge and capacity and expertise in 1 year that would be fulfilling, other than just like having a degree that said Dartmouth? And so I deferred from that. And then since I'd grown up in Minnesota, and they have top ranked public policy and public health programs, I just decided to do a dual degree at home. Gave me a lot of flexibility to stay home and get involved with some things in the community, in the state, that I don't feel like I would have gotten if I had gone anywhere else.
Right. Yeah, sometimes things just seem to fall in place like that with where you're supposed to be. And Dartmouth is appealing, but also very expensive, like you say, for 1 year, uprooting your whole life. You mentioned being able to get involved in some things locally that you wouldn't have had the opportunity to otherwise. In my notes, I have here that you were the first Indigenous person appointed as a member to the Minnesota Environmental Quality Board.
That's correct.
All right. I feel like maybe we can touch a little bit on that later when we talk about the actual watershed and kind of like the environmental aspects.
Okay.
Yeah, so you kind of had a big circle in terms of your academics, beginning in Anoka Hennepin, then Breck, then Gustavus, then
Yeah.
Augsburg, then North Dakota State,
UND.
UND, University of North Dakota, then University of Minnesota Morris, and then University of Minnesota Twin Cities.
Yep.
Wow. Well, congratulations, you're almost done.
And actually, when I was growing up, when I was a little kid, my first connection with U of M Twin Cities was my parents were on the American Indian Advisory Board that they had.
Oh, wow.
And so I remember just being like a little tyke, coming with them to campus, playing around in the classrooms while they're doing their meetings. But, that's for me a reminder of just like how long I've been connected in one way, shape, or form with this institution, which has played in part why I'm like really passionate about that Truth Project.
Right.
Because there's a lot of things that I'm finding out for the first time, whether it be like from the university level, from the state level, just with respect to the truth,
Right.
and how history has been glossed over.
Right.
With respect to like what I was taught through my K through 12 education, and thinking about if I'm learning these things for the first time, there's people that go throughout their whole lives not understanding the true history, the true nature of how Minnesota came to be.
Right. Right. And then even thinking about, the different histories of these individual institutions with Gustavus, so close to that US Dakota war history.
Mm-hmm.
I had the opportunity to talk to Eric Buffalo Head last week, and he shared some of the institutional history of Augsburg, thinking about the institutional history of University of Minnesota Morris, and now the history of University of Minnesota, which you've been able to be involved in kind of recovering through the Truth Project. I don't know much about University of North Dakota though, but I assume there's a very interesting American Indian history entangled with that institution as well.
Oh yeah, for sure. And even the state of North Dakota.
Yeah. So in thinking about the Bassett Creek area, the Hahawakpadan area, have you thought about this Dakota place and your relationship to it as a Native person?
Yeah, as I think about what its use was for the Dakota people pre-European American contact, as a trail, a route, navigable route used for fishing along it and its tributaries. Like when I as I mentioned, having the chance to go fishing out in Medicine Lake, it's like there's always like as I cross the Mississippi, sometimes when I was walking on campus when I was back in Minneapolis, sometimes I just stop or by the Stone Arch Bridge where the falls are at, St. Anthony Falls are at. I always just like stop and like try to imagine how things existed before all the buildings were there, and try to just erase all of that and think about how things used to be. And so like, even though I'm on like a motorized boat on Medicine Lake fishing with my dad, like I think about, what it would have been like to be there in like the 1800s, 1700s, fishing there, with father and son, or with, having those connections and being able to experience the beauty of nature in a way that we can experience due to, all the development, all the destruction, all the pollution that's gone into Bassett Creek.
Right.
Is, it's definitely not, no way, shape, or form is it the same. No way, shape, or form is it like a true realization of what it used to be. And these are some of the things that like, I eventually found out about Bassett Creek, about, the flooding that happened when Minneapolis was first created, as a city, and how powerful that was. And then thinking about how it just got manipulated over the course of time by man-made structures, by the U.S. Army Corps, all these, different entities. It's a unfortunate realization of how colonialism and all these structures see Mother Nature as a commodified resource that can be manipulated in different ways. And so I always think about how things used to be.
Right.
Even from like Brooklyn Park,
Right.
I didn't know that Brooklyn Park used to have, or did have, and still has like a couple trails that Ojibwa people, Dakota people used to use, like, back before it was, settled. And so hearing about those different connections, seeing those connections, it makes me realize that there's a lot more that needs to go into storytelling with respect to these places.
Right. I think, as somebody else who grew up in the Twin Cities, like we almost, we're so familiar with the history as Native people, and recognizing the significance of that place, of the Twin Cities built around the Mississippi River and the Minnesota River, right? Like that happened for a reason. But the lack of knowledge by the general public about that history and the significance of that place, for Dakota people in particular, with like Badote. I think when you're talking about like the development and the deliberate, efforts to redesign the rivers to capture like hydropower, right? And how that has affected such a significant spiritual place for Dakota people. That's not something we see happen in other sacred sites, ceremonial sites. And it really is, it's really sad to know that happened in the past, but it's something that's still ongoing with the pollution and development in these particular areas. So kind of on the flip side of that, how has living in a predominantly white suburb, we know that kind of has changed during your time in Brooklyn Park, but how has growing up in a suburb away from your home communities influenced your identity as a Native person?
I guess I'll say two things. The first one is, going back to the story about the racist neighbor that I had and what he mentioned with, if you can't live by the white man's laws, move back to the reservation, is like, I didn't know about it at the time because I was just like a little kid, about like what my life's trajectory was going to be, or what, for me, I felt like, going to Gustavus and Augsburg, they're both Lutheran institutions. So they're big about vocation, or like what your calling is. And then at the same time, growing up with my Native American spirituality is having a understanding through the course of my life of the Creator brought me here for a purpose, gave me, certain skill sets and the talents that I could use. That instilled with me now a desire to affect or try to affect public policy. And so for me in my education, public health had been a big component with respect to American Indian health outcomes and, disparities that exist not only with those outcomes, but also with healthcare delivery services through Indian Health Service. And so, but then, that also being tied to environmental justice or injustice, environmental racism, and, thinking about, like when I think about like Prairie Island and the nuclear caskets that are in their lands, all those different decisions that are made is, it instilled with me a desire to say, okay, if this is how things are, or this is how things, and then like just the idea of like piecemeal change to get to where we want to be with respect to, at least for Native nations, like tribal, full utmost realization of tribal sovereignty and self-determination, and then what that means for each individual tribe. It was like, okay, these are how systems exist, but that doesn't necessarily mean that these are how systems and decisions have to be made in the future.
Right.
And so that formed with me this inherent desire to advocate, not only for Native Americans, but then the second point I was going to get to is growing up in Minneapolis, and especially everything that we've come to realize on a national level with respect to everything that happened after George Floyd was murdered, was, this realization that these systemic inequalities, although we have this idea of Minnesota nice and Minnesota as one of the best states to live in, when you start carving out, all these things by race, you start seeing how there's definitely been a power structure that's benefited a certain people over, you know, the domination and exploitation of several other groups of people. And so, you know, with that understanding is, you know, it was an identity for me that, you know, it was like I became a fighter, a warrior, of, you know, being able to try to affect public policy, whether that be like me running for office somewhere down the line, or me as a policy practitioner trying to influence those people who are making those decisions. And so, you know, yeah, that kind of ties into some of the work that I've done since then with, you know, state governance and boards and stuff like that.
Right. I mean, we need advocates and allies, including our own community members on multiple fronts. And your expertise in policy work is going to be so beneficial. Yeah.
I hope so.
In terms of culture and cultural involvement, were you involved in any cultural activities in the area, either through school or outside of school, in the community where you grew up? Or is that something you maybe went to Minneapolis to participate in? Or is that something you and your family returned to your tribal or reservation communities for?
I was a little bit of all the above. You know, in the cities, being able to, you know, go to Minneapolis American Indian Center, that provided a lot of connection with respect to, you know, going to powwows, going to activities, you know, being a part of the community. There's always, you know, these local university powwows like University of Minnesota, Augsburg, some of these other institutions that held those like more community spaces. But, you know, growing up, on my mom's side in Turtle Mountains, we'd go back for, you know, healing ceremonies and sweats. And on my dad's side, their tribe down in Zuni, they're a lot more connected with the culture. A lot of, you know, children grow up learning the language first. And there's a sacred time called Shalako during the winter solstice, which is, you know, when we would go down to be with our grandparents and our family to go through, you know, the month-long ceremony. But you know, it was difficult when we'd be in Minneapolis and hear about different sweats, because there's a certain amount of trust that goes into, you know, being able to either, you know, both join people, but also be able to, you know, follow or, you know, put your faith and guidance into, you know, someone who's leading the ceremony that you might not necessarily know. And so those, you know, those relationships took time to develop. And then, you know, being able to build that trust was, you know, something that was essential that my dad taught me.
Right.
And that was something that, you know, I still think about even, you know, now that I'm out here in Seattle, is being mindful of that.
Right. These communities and the social networks, they can't just be replicated anywhere. And that does take time. Yeah, absolutely. Thinking about Hahawakdan and the actual name. So Hahawakdan is the Dakota name for Bassett Creek. What do you think about the role and importance of language and place names, particularly in these settler colonial white spaces?
I think an important example is the whole process that went behind changing Betamacaska from Lake Calhoun. And the backlash that was happening by some. And I remember there was a SaveLakeCalhoun.com. There's a website that, you know, this whole movement, these whole things that existed to push back against it was a realization about why we need these types of efforts, these types of movements. And even thinking about Fort Snelling, the fight that our state legislators wanted to have against changing it to Fort Snelling at Bedote is, you know, very eye-opening with respect to, you know, how much we still have to, you know, push for advocacy for these name changes. Because
right.
when when you get people to engage in that process of changing from, I still hear some people say Lake Calhoun, but I still hear other people changing to saying, Betamakaska. And I think once you start making that transition, not only do you do that, but then you're curious about, okay, what does that mean?
Mm-hmm.
What does what does it translate to?
Right. There's teachings.
And that's the thing that I love about when these name changes happen, or even just like signage that goes up to acknowledge this is these are these lands, or that's something that MnDOT is doing with respect to the reservation boundaries. And when you start to dissect, like I said, what these translations are, instead of Bassett Creek just being named after some guy, last name Bassett,
Joel Bassett.
it's like, instead of that being like, oh, that's what we're going to name it after, is you have these descriptive words that describe, whether it be like a knowledge that was gained from that specific piece of land or waterway, or it's like, I'm never going to be able to pronounce the word, but like how there's a Ojibwa word for blueberry pie.
Oh yes, like that's the longest word, right?
Yeah, but everything in it describes the whole process about
right, how like the ingredients. Yeah.
And so it's like when you're able to learn about it from that perspective, not only does it teach you about that name, the language, but also then the culture. And then once you're immersed in that understanding of culture, then hopefully at that point you're like more intrigued to say, I want to learn more.
Right.
And then I want to start having conversations, whether it be with Native people, or even just conversations you have with your neighbor who are not non-native to non-native, to start engaging those conversations to understand. Because I know like there's a Reclaiming Native Truth study that was done through like Illuminative that just talked about public perceptions of Native Americans. We have all these stereotypes that exist, from Disney movies to sports mascots to pop culture and dances with wolves and stuff like that. And it's like, instead of that being the running narrative or considering us as like a relic of the past, you get to have these conversations about, we exist now, we advocated for these changes, and we're here.
Right. And I think so much of that work, like the dual signage or name changes, or even getting that on somebody's radar to talk about, can also help to do the work to push back against the people like your neighbor, right?
Yeah.
You can push back against those exclusionary mentalities, because we are still here, right? This is a Dakota place. So really, what was the neighbor doing there,
Yeah, no, definitely. Or even like an acknowledgement. I don't think there's many people that know, like, the Santee Sioux that were exiled, and having a conversation about what it means for this to be their homeland, to be pushed so far away. And then, even with like the American Indian tuition waiver from the University of Minnesota, it's like, why aren't they included?
Right. Right. They were forcibly exiled from their homeland. So when the tuition waiver becomes effective, they will not be eligible for it. Right.
Yeah.
Those are really important conversations to have and to continue to encourage. Yeah. Thinking about this oral history project in particular, it grew out of a land acknowledgement process, something that the Valley Community Presbyterian Church took on, and then did the important work of doing more, which is where we're at today. So what do you think about land acknowledgements in general? And then after the work has been done to create a land acknowledgement, which could be just words on a paper, right? What are important follow-up or supplementary steps that need to be done to make it respectful and responsible?
Land acknowledgements. I joke around that I'm a professional expert at it, just because I've been asked so many times to help write them, and it's been an interesting development as I've seen more institutions, more organizations start to incorporate land acknowledgements. It seemed like, an exciting opportunity when it, first started taking off. It was like, okay, so if this is like the first step, then what? Or, of, some type of process of acknowledgement.
Mhm.
And I don't necessarily, the thing that I'm worried about is because so many institutions are doing it, is that it's just becoming like a fad or part of, just like a movement of, if we do this, we can wipe our hands clean.
Give ourselves a pat on the back.
Yeah, and I actually heard one time someone give a land acknowledgement, and then immediately after they gave the land acknowledgement, they said, okay, now that we got that out of the way, and then started jumping into their presentation. And so it's just like, sometimes there's a mindlessness that goes into it, and just saying like, this is the politically correct thing to do now.
Right.
And so then the question becomes, all right, so if that's, especially with those kinds of institutions or those kinds of individuals that are doing it in that way, it's like, okay, then what? Now what?
Mhm.
And it was interesting. I saw my friend had shared a document about like, okay, you doing a land acknowledgement, now what? And the first thing said, give land back.
Yep.
And that seems to be the most controversial thing, or things that are laughed at. Is like, okay, you'll hear like do-gooders saying, okay, now what can we do to, be an advocate, be an ally? And just, straight up, they were just like, give the land back. And, that's like, that's like one of the ultimate aspects with respect to what that true land acknowledgement, honoring of what it would be to be like, we stole your land.
Mhm.
Okay, and you're not going to give it back. But then it becomes an understanding of, okay, then what? And then at that point, then what becomes what resources are available to you as an institution or as an organization.
Right.
And so, like projects like this, where you're able to spread awareness through creating like this oral project, whether it be, with like federal agencies or even state entities doing co-management with tribes,
Mhm.
be able to, manage the lands that were within their territories. Those are opportunities that I think are starting to take somewhat effect now that we're looking at climate change as being like a real thing happening to, not only like the fires in California, New Mexico right now, but the droughts that happened, last summer in Minnesota. And then, the flash rains that happened, and, the capacity for like sewers in Twin Cities to be able to manage that capacity.
Right.
These are all things that are happening right now. And when it comes to land acknowledgement, it is that understanding that we're still here, our people are still here, we're still connected to this land. And as we're facing an existential crisis like this, there needs to be that not just a returning of land, but a returning of knowledge, of decision making, of taking care of land, environmental stewardship,
Mhm.
back to the original caretakers of the land. And some different levels and entities we're getting there. And so I feel like those are signs of positive movement, but it just needs to progress a lot faster. And so
Right.
just like this wave of land acknowledgements quickly picked up steam, the next phase of what these different institutions are able to do needs to be implemented.
Right. Like we need action beyond the words.
Yep.
So you just touched on some environmental concerns, very pressing environmental concerns. So this next question is about the management of the Wakdan Bassett Creek watershed and the surrounding area today. So is there any advice or initiatives or suggestions you would like to see to those who steward the Wakdan Bassett Creek watershed? There is a specific Bassett Creek Watershed Commission.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like, one of the important things from the perspective of being on the Environmental Quality Board for Minnesota, as being the first Indigenous person, was the perspective that I brought to, the decision making, the conversations that we had.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like, if you could get Indigenous representation on a watershed board like that, it goes a long way with respect to how you can maybe not, be the arbiter of change to get everyone to change their minds, but you can influence conversations that get people thinking about things that they might not necessarily have thought of,
Right.
or even advocating for the community. Because that was one thing that I realized through my membership as a citizen member was sometimes our citizens were lost in the shuffle. And when it came to public engagement, community engagement, even though that was supposed to be like a centerpiece of our work, is I felt, and I got emails from a lot of our citizens from Minnesota that were saying like they didn't feel like they were heard. It was more just like, we'll listen and then move on. But once you incorporate champions like that who are able to advocate based on experience, based on knowledge, based on that advocacy, that goes a long way with respect to how decisions are made. And I know that there's cleanup going on, and I know that that's a necessity as I think about just the the underground tunnel going through Minneapolis, and thinking about how dangerous that would be for Mississippi River, for contaminants, all those heavy metals to get to seep into the river and contaminate what was already at one point a heavily destructed river. And as we think about, I know like recently there was conversation about talking about removing of dams, and thinking about the impacts that that'll all have on not only Bassett Creek, but then also Mississippi and what it flows into.
Right. Yeah, it's just hard to think about how much damage has been done and the effort to get people to pay enough attention to do something to change it for the future.
Yeah.
I've been learning a lot about the watershed, speaking to other folks for this oral history project as well. I also feel like Bassett Creek is such a good place to begin because it's smaller in scale than something like the Mississippi River. There's still so many individual like private property parcels of land that butt up against it. And how do we take action with like those individual citizens that you mentioned as well, that maybe would care if they knew more about this history and significance. So part of the work of this oral history project is to share that history and then to be in communication with people like the Bassett Creek Watershed Commission as well. So hopefully they take heed to these wise words.
Well, I can definitely carry that message on because I also serve on the Minnesota BIPOC Environmental Justice Table. And so, North Minneapolis being, a heavily minority community, experiencing a lot of different environmental injustices. I know they have like lead contamination that's worse than Flint. And with the paint.
Wow.
And so, yeah, these are definitely pressing issues that we can definitely see what we can do to build up awareness, because public education is such a vital aspect to all of this work.
Yeah, two folks I've met through this project, I don't know if you know who they are. Roxanne Gould, she's Ojibwe, and her husband, Jim Rock, is Dakota. And they live right in Golden Valley, not far from the watershed. And they are very staunch advocates of restoration and environmental cleanup. So we can always be in touch after this project too, if you need more allies to join you.
Yeah, no, definitely.
I mean, they knew so much about the environmental history. It was really great being able to talk to them.
He was instructor for that Native American math and science company.
Oh, yes, he's very, I just learned so much about him, or from him. They're both faculty up at University of Minnesota Duluth, getting to that point in life where they can retire, but they also lead a land recovery project west of the Twin Cities as well.
Okay.
But yeah, if you were in town, you could see them on Saturday, June 4th, but maybe sometime in the future when you come back to visit or something, it would be nice to set up a visit.
Well, my parents are still there, so yeah, I'll try to find a time to come back.
Yeah, they were excited too to learn about some of the other folks participating in this project. So I think you would have lots of mutual interests.
That's awesome.
So 2 questions to wrap up here.
Okay.
So thinking about the future, what would you like future generations to know about your experiences as a Native person growing up and living in a suburb?
Future generations, what would I want them to know? I think the first thing that came to me was like resiliency, because it was just like going through so much with respect to being like, even for me as an individual, like an overweight Native American with glasses was like 3 strikes I had against me that like people just ridiculed me on a daily basis. And the one thing it taught me is like, that sense of resiliency is like, I'm still here. I'm, a little bit bruised and battered, but, through these experiences, but through the course of that, what I realized is, there's a lot of people out there that have gone through similar experiences. They might not be Native. It could be, people from all different walks of life, but being able to find those people as a support group, people to lean on, is vital with respect to just, not like saying like make it as in like, it can be a struggle like that sometimes, but that support system is vital with respect to being able to adapt, being able to navigate these structures. And I know there's a lot changing, like I said, with Brooklyn Park. In my experience now, it's a majority minority community, but these institutions, whether or not they're in suburbia or like higher education, land grant institutions, is that resiliency is going to come in handy, as saying it lightly, but it's going to be vital with respect to navigating these institutions, whether or not you want to change them or you just want to get through them.
Mm-hmm.
And either way, there's still those underlying experiences that sometimes a lot of us go through, is, whether it be natives or people of color, that finding that support group is vital. And it changes over the course of time, as
Right.
you navigate these different institutions, but there's always people out there that are willing to listen, willing to be there to be a support. And I know for me personally, I didn't necessarily do all that reaching out. I was an introvert, but it's good to be mindful of the fact that, like you were saying with Roxanne and with Jim, is you might, I felt like when I first started off in that environmental advocacy role, is that I was navigating by myself.
Mm-hmm.
But it's like there's so many people out there that
Right.
are either going to be supportive, be allies, or be there to help you fight, or even just be there to listen to you as you're going through what you're going through.
Mm-hmm.
And just being able to talk, but also being able to listen,
Mm-hmm.
especially to elders. I guess I just leave it on that note, is it took me a while to figure out who to trust with respect to elders and with respect to asking, for mentorship and guidance. But that was something that I wish I started earlier. I didn't get a chance to live with my grandparents. And so I didn't necessarily have that, grandparent figure role. But as I've, in the past couple of years, as I've started to reach out, listening to kind-hearted elders share wisdom, share knowledge about their experiences, what they've gone through, but also just how to navigate through life and stresses and everything that goes along with it, that's been, as I'm getting older now, the biggest gift that the Creator has given me, is that ability to connect.
Yeah, I feel like that was the best answer. I don't have anything to add to that at all. But I will say, I think, if anything, this oral history project can offer is that for other young Native people at some point to find these, right? And hear these stories. And yeah, it can be a struggle to grow up in these places that are really white, away from communities, have racist neighbors, get teased for having long Indian hair. But the real resiliency. And then so much of what I've learned from you, Ben, is that you've always, been connected to your community, like you and your family have done the work to maintain that. But now you are in a point in your life where you're able to work to give back to the Native community, wherever you are living. And you've been doing that, since your time at the University of Minnesota, in particular, being on these different state level agencies.
Yeah, and that's something that I hope I get to continue to do for the rest of my life.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually wanted to add something to that last answer that I had, because it just came to me. Is that all right?
Yeah, of course. My next question is there anything else you would like to add?
Oh, okay. Well, yeah, okay. So what I was thinking about, and this was like with respect to identity, growing up as a suburban Native, I still wasn't accepted even within like the urban Native community. When I was going to Augsburg, I was tutoring at South High in Minneapolis for All Nations program. And I remember plenty of times like I get on at the Franklin Station light rail, and people would call me an apple. I was red on the outside and white on the inside. And when I think about, how connected I've been with not only my community, but my culture and, ceremony and, everything that's gone into the teachings that, my relatives have provided me through the course of my life, is like that definitely hurt, when
Mm-hmm.
when I experienced lateral oppression,
Right.
and what it means like to be less than both in the eyes of white people, but then also my own people. And like, it sat with me for a long time, but what also sat with me with respect to that was like belonging,
Mm-hmm.
where my sense of belonging was. And, I grew up with white friends. I grew up with, a bunch of other, all types of friends. And it was always just something that was like a strike against me. And so like as I grew up, and this was even like up until recently and moving around, it was just like having internal conversations with myself about where home was, or
Yeah.
where home is. And like I've shared so far, is I pretty much grew up in Brooklyn Park in that same house my entire life. And it felt like a house, but not a home.
Mm-hmm.
It was a home because my family was there. And then that got me thinking about, okay, where is home for me?
Right.
I live in Seattle, but it's not my home. It's just, it's a place where I'm living right now. But as I thought about it, and growing up, I've been fortunate enough to go back to both of the reservations that my parents come from. Turtle Mountains multiple times a year. Zuni, since it was so far and we had a big family, maybe like we'd go once a year during Shalco. And as I grew up and started to travel more and go there and think about it, it was always just this understanding of, just for me at that point, and what I've come to realize is home is where my family's at.
Mm-hmm.
It's not it's not necessarily tied to all these places that I've lived, but where my family is, they all have a piece of my heart. And that's been a major source of strength for me when I've thought about that. And so with this Western mentality of like, that's your home, that's where you live, is like
Your physical structure.
yeah, from a different perspective, is like home is where all my family's at, because that's where all my connections are at, and that's where all the love is. And so I think that was like a big revelation for me, as I felt like I was kind of lost trying to figure out where my place was in this world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Ben.
Yeah, of course. You're welcome.
Naya chopna becha wopira tanka ungeni chiapi. Thank you for listening. This project may serve as a model for other communities that seek to go beyond land acknowledgement. To learn more about this oral history project, please contact Hennepin History Museum. The project was produced following the standards and principles of the Oral History Association. In addition to this podcast, the interview recordings, transcripts, and narrator files included signed legal released agreements can be found at the Hennepin History Museum. Funding and other support was provided by the St. Anthony's Falls Heritage Board, Hennepin History Museum, Valley Community Presbyterian Church, and the University of Wisconsin. This publication was also made possible in part by the people of Minnesota through a grant funded by an appropriation to the Minnesota Historical Society from the Minnesota Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. Any views, findings, opinions, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this publication are those of the authors and do not necessarily represent those of the state of Minnesota, the Minnesota Historical Society, or the Minnesota Historic Resources Advisory Committee. Anaya chopna pecha wopira unkeni chiapi. Thank you for listening.